30 anos após a chegada de Margaret Thatcher ao poder no Reino Unido, até os adversários dela, e não são poucos, admitem que esta mulher de classe média baixa da Inglaterra, filha de comerciante, formada em química, foi uma das pessoas mais influentes da política internacional no fim do século XX. Está agora aposentada, não muito saudável, quieta e fora da política. O nome Thatcher ecoa até hoje, para o bem ou para o mal, como símbolo de uma visão de mundo e de uma prática política e econômica que ganhou até nome de doutrina, Thatcherismo. Representa o culto ao mercado livre e à iniciativa privada como fontes de prosperidade, em oposição à intervenção do Estado, vista sempre como uma inconveniência, se não um pecado conceitual. A passagem de Thatcher pelo comando do Reino Unido, de 1979 a 90, coincidiu em parte com a presidência nos Estados Unidos do mais próximo aliado ideológico dela, Ronald Reagan, garantindo assim uma influência maior sobre eventos internacionais do que ela teria sozinha como líder de uma potência hoje de segundo nível, não mais o império influente do passado. A Guerra Fria teve em Thatcher uma combatente feroz, e o fim dessa divisão ideológica do mundo, com a queda do Muro de Berlim, coincidiu com o suspiro final da chamada Dama de Ferro no poder. Ela foi arrancada de Downing Street, não pelas urnas, mas por manobra interna do Partido Conservador, preocupado com as eleições que viriam em breve. Neste ano em que se completam 3 décadas desde a chegada de Thatcher ao poder, e em plena crise do modelo de economia laissez-faire que ela promoveu, qual o legado de Thatcher? O Milênio foi atrás da resposta com Richard Weiner, autor do mais recente livro sobre Thatcher, seu impacto político e social. Ele é professor de História no conceituado King's College de Londres.
Before we actually discuss Thatcher herself, the subject of your book, let's deal with what became known as Thatcherism. The academics and scholars came up with this concept, which involved rollback of the states, cut taxes, fight inflation, laissez-faire economics, anti-communism. What else is part of this?
I think it's a mixture of two things, and I think it's rooted very much in its times. So I think one of the things one has to remember is that Thatcherism emerges out of Britain in the late 1970s. So it's not some kind of political genie that you can take out of the bottle at any particular point in history and apply it instantly. It was devised for a particular place in a particular time. And I think it's a mixture of two things, the kind of hard elements that you've outlined there. So anti-communism being very important in the context of the high Cold War, a desire to roll back the British state, to reduce state spending, or at least to reduce the rate of increase of state spending, because state spending is increasing very sharply in the 1970s, to control inflation, which becomes the object of what's called monetarism, the desire to control inflation by controlling the money supply, to be cracked down on trade union power. Those are the kind of hard elements of it. But I think that then ties in with a more kind of cultural rightward drift in British politics, which I guess is associated partly with a reaction against the kind of broad spirit of 1968, so a defence of the family, a defence of traditional morality, an opposition to immigration, a desire to crack down on crime. And those two things come together, and that, I think, is what creates the Thatcherism of 1979.
Was there a certain coherence to this doctrine, and she was just making things up as time passed?
I think there's coherence to Thatcherism, but not necessarily coherence to Thatcher. So there are people around Thatcher who kind of think Thatcherism. So her advisors in some cases, her predecessors, the British right-wing politician Enoch Powell, who's a very coherent thinker, but also, of course, a very unrealistic thinker. So he always devises projects that are logical, but not necessarily realisable. There's a marvellous moment when Margaret Thatcher rebukes Enoch Powell in the House of Commons, and she comes out with this phrase that says everything about Thatcher herself, which is, she says, in strict academic logic, the honourable gentleman is right. In every other term, he's wrong. Now, Thatcher is not someone who values strict academic logic. So she's always a pragmatist. She always knows that there's a limit to what realistically can be done. And of course, that limit changes as time goes on. So the things that can be done are not always the same. she's someone who takes ideas from different places and mixes them up, so she's a synthesizer. So I think there are different coherent streams of ideas coming into Thatcher, and she kind of pulls them together.
She claimed to be an intellectual follower on the political philosophy of Frederick Hayek, and on economics of Milton Friedman, the American economist, laissez-faire economics and monetarism. But is this just a post-fact attempt to give a certain intellectual weight, or did she really follow these guys, read them, and knew what they were about?
I think she probably did read them, probably did admire them, but I think Thatcherism, like most practical political doctrines, is more to do with how it's constructed in power and less to do with the writings of academics. Thatcher certainly admires Hayek and Friedman. Some of the people around her, and including especially some of the people who are important in the making of her economic policies, are actually rather dismissive, especially of Friedman. So Nigel Lawson has this phrase about monetarism, where he says, it does not the product of the brain of an eccentric American professor. So I think the answer is, it plays a role in the kind of prestige of Thatcherism, but not, I think, a huge role in the making of policy.
In your book, you quote one of her close associates, Alfred Sherman, a person who supposedly knew her well, worked together, and he published a book in 2005 in which he writes, "In the 8 years that we worked closely together, I have never heard her express an original idea or even an insightful question." Kind of cruel, perhaps, coming from a close friend, but is it true?
It's a remark that says much about Alfred Sherman and a bit about Margaret Thatcher. So that, obviously, she's not an intellectual in the way that Sherman likes to think of himself as an intellectual. I think, as I say, that she's a synthesizer of other people's ideas rather than a creator of her ideas. I think the role that she plays, though, in holding different people together, balancing different people out, is quite a useful one. I think it's also important to remember that Sherman belongs himself to a very specific group of people who advise Thatcher, write her speeches, but probably never exercise much central power. They're never ministers, they never hold formal political office. And that group of people in due course become rather bitter because they think of themselves having invented Thatcherism and then not getting the credit for it. And in fact, of course, they were always, I think, rather unrealistic about the extent to which being listened to by Margaret Thatcher was the same as influencing her.
You call her a synthesizer. Certainly she was a pragmatist, a very instinctive politician. And what do you think that came from? Is it her upbringing, her education, going to Oxford, the daughter of a greengrocer, middle-class woman? What made her so instinctively political?
I think all those things probably to some extent. I think one can overstate her kind of lower middle-class grocer's daughter background. After all, she's probably slightly socially higher than her subsequent mythology presents her as being. It becomes useful to her in due course to present herself as having come in from relatively humble origins. I think actually she's left a lot of those origins behind at quite an early stage in her career. She doesn't really go back to Grantham, the town she's born in, much after her 20s. The key moment in her life personally, I think, is probably her marriage to Dennis Thatcher, who's a much wealthier man, and it's his wealth that gives her the kind of independence to pursue a political career. I think probably the key bits of her career are from 1959 onwards, the moment she enters the House of Commons. And from then on, of course, she's very much working with real day-to-day politics. I think it's important to remember that she's never a presidential-style politician in the way that, say, Ronald Reagan is. So she's always working in teams. The House of Commons forces you to work with other people. So she's always having to balance other people's interests. She's always having to work with short-term aims, so she holds a succession of relatively minor offices, and that forces her to think about what is realistic within each time horizon that she's given. And I think until late in her career, probably until, maybe until early 1975, she has absolutely no conception that she's going to be Prime Minister. With a lot of politicians, one is aware that there are long-term ambitions and short-term pragmatism, and that the politician is always aware of the long-term ambition. I think Thatcher is so intrinsically pragmatic that she doesn't really distinguish between what is realisable and what she would like to do. And therefore, I think up until the end of 1974, she thinks the most that any woman can hope to be in the British political system is probably Chancellor of the Exchequer, Minister of Finances, basically. And it's only at the very last moment, because no one else dares to stand against Edward Heath for the leadership of the Conservative Party, that suddenly the idea she might be leader of a political party comes into view. And of course it's only when she puts herself forward as leader of a political party that she's also required to have a broad political philosophy, rather than simply an idea about the particular department of government that she's going to run.
If you mention Reagan and then Thatcher, we can mention them together. Of course, the two of them and their ideas came to represent a certain way of looking at the world, a certain way of dealing with society, with economics and all that. Reaganism and Thatcherism. And the crisis of the past couple of years have led a lot of people to say that period is dead and buried in history. Is it?
No. First of all, I'd stress that I think there's always a gulf between Reaganism and Thatcherism, although I think they're personally close, and although they work in parallel, we must remember that Thatcher never succeeded and probably never tried to roll back the state to the extent that the state is rolled back in the United States. So in that sense, it would be difficult to judge the two of them together. I think also that the kind of discomfort that people have felt in the last year with certain kinds of free market economics makes them understate the extent to which those free market economics are really now entrenched in the way we do things. So that at the most recent British budget, the top rate of income tax was raised to 50%. Now, you've got to remember that for most of the Thatcher period, rates of tax in Britain were higher than that. It was only in 1988 that the Conservatives dared lower the top rate of income tax from 60 to 40%. So in fact, the rate of tax being charged under a Labour government in Britain now is lower than it was being charged by a Conservative government for most of the Thatcher period.
She won elections, 3 elections successively, 79, 83, 87. You know, she dominated politics. The British voted for her, voted for the party, but they didn't quite like her personally. Why was that?
Well, partly it ties in again with the British political system, which is that we don't directly elect a Prime Minister. It's not a presidential system. We elect MPs, who in turn elect the leader of a party who becomes Prime Minister. So people don't necessarily have to like their Prime Ministers in the way that I think, for example, the Americans did have to like Reagan to some extent to elect him. The British political system quite often functions on political leaders who are not particularly popular as individuals. I think there's also a sense that we lived in hard times in the late 70s, early 1980s, and you needed a hard person for hard times. So that there's a very strong sense that Thatcher is a confrontational politician, an aggressive politician in some ways, not the kind of person you'd want to have to dinner, but perhaps the kind of person you'd want to lead the country.
Which leads us to, in a sense, to her political end, you know, not the story overall, but what you just explained about the structure of the British politics. A lot of non-British people have a hard time understanding why this woman, who was so well known all over the world, all of a sudden was removed from power without having lost an election. All of a sudden she was no longer Prime Minister. Please explain to our viewers who are not as familiar with the British system how that came about, perhaps as a result of that unpopularity you mentioned before.
Yeah, I think in technical terms the answer is very straightforward, which is that in order to go on being Prime Minister, she had to go on being leader of the Conservative Party in the House of Commons, and Conservative members of Parliament have the right to eject her as leader, which in turn ejected her as Prime Minister. Now, why did they do that? The short-term answer again is that they did it because they were frightened that they would lose an election if they fought it under Margaret Thatcher. They were increasingly aware that she was unpopular as an individual. I think there were broader factors behind that, which were partly the point that I've mentioned earlier, that so many battles had been won that Thatcher's very confrontational style seemed less and less useful by the late 1980s. That's one element of it. I think a second element of it is that Thatcher herself is becoming increasingly interfering in the late 1980s, so that having had some very simple points on which she mobilises in the early 1980s, she becomes increasingly complicated in her politics, and it takes her into new domains. There's a lovely moment when the British political journalist Alan Watkins writes an article saying that he's going to have one of those cards printed that you can have in the event of an accident, And in the event of an accident, it's going to say, in the event of an accident, I do not wish to be visited by the Prime Minister, because there is this sense that Mrs. Thatcher is kind of interfering in every minor problem that pops up in the country. That makes her unpopular. I think she drifts a long way to the right on Europe, and that makes her unpopular with a large part of the Conservative Party, bits of which are actually very pro-European. And also, particularly, one conflict has come to an end, which was a conflict that was very defining for her early years, which is the Cold War. So, of course, by the time she falls, something is happening which would have seemed inconceivable when she came to power in 1979, which is Soviet troops are going home from Eastern Europe. And that, first of all, produces a sense that we don't need this kind of iron lady in international affairs anymore. Secondly, it produces a possibility of expansion of Europe and reunification of Germany, which creates all sorts of problems because of Thatcher's anti-European attitude. And I think the final point one should make is that, of course, she is replaced by someone who, in economic terms, is very much a Thatcherite, John Major. So there's a very strong element to which, extent to which, Thatcher has to be destroyed so Thatcherism can live.
Still, the UK today, obviously a different country, 30 years after she came into power. But don't you think the country, post-imperial, even post-Thatcher, is still fighting above its weight on a diplomatic level, internationally?
I think it's probably trying to do. It's uncertain whether that's a good thing or not. There's always, of course, in any country, a difference between the interests of the political classes and the interest of ordinary people. So that if you're a political leader, it's always desirable that your country should be seen as powerful and that you should have all the pleasures of, being invited to George Bush's ranch and so on and so forth. It's not terribly clear what that delivers for ordinary British people. There are plenty of middle-sized, undemonstrative countries in the world which enjoy very high standards of living and seem very happy places. So in that sense, I'm not sure that punching above one's weight is necessarily a desirable thing. I think, of course, punching above one's weight has also changed in time, so that there's a post-imperial phrase where we're losing our empire and trying, as the American Secretary of State famously said, to find a role. And the role we found, I suppose, in the 1960s was largely the role of being America's best friend, which perhaps was never a very satisfactory role. That, I think, is the role that under Tony Blair we kind of resurrected in the late 1990s.
And took it to extremes.
Took it to extremes, yeah. I think under Thatcher things are a bit more complicated in that, of course, in this endgame of the Cold War, there was a period in which Britain was not a hugely important country in the way that the United States or the Soviet Union were, but it was a kind of frontline country. I mean, the Cold War was, after all, a battle that would have been fought in Europe if it ever actually had broken into hot war. And I think that's a period where Britain is particularly important. I think Thatcher's relationship with the end of the Cold War is quite significant. I think the perception the Soviets have that they're a particularly tough set of opponents is very important in the way they reform, and I think the key people there are three rather incongruous people: Reagan, Thatcher and Mitterrand in France. Mitterrand in France, one forgets, is also a very anti-communist figure, and for this reason rather admiring of Thatcher. So I think that's a moment where Britain does pay.
That's a curious relationship, isn't it, Mitterrand and Thatcher, because ideologically they stand so far apart. But they kind of got along in their own way, didn't they? You wouldn't think so, but they did.
They get along, I think, one could say, frivolously, partly because if Mitterrand knows one thing, it's how to flatter a woman, and Thatcher is by no means immune to male charm of that kind. So I think that's part of the reason for their relatively good relations. I think, as I say, anti-communism is a very important part of it. I think Mitterrand, though theoretically a left-winger, is a man with many fewer illusions than many left-wingers have in the 1980s, so that I think he recognises a great deal of what Thatcher is doing as being possibly desirable. And of course he rallies behind Britain very strongly during the Falklands War, partly, I think, because he sees Britain as a key part of the anti-communist alliance. Also, of course, he has very strong sentimental reasons. Mitterrand has been dropped into occupied France by the British Navy in 1944. You can understand why he's not keen to see French missiles destroy British naval ships during the Falklands War. There's a marvellous story told in Douglas Hurd's memoirs, which is that just after the Falklands War, Mitterrand goes to see Thatcher. And Thatcher's very nervous because she assumes that, having supported her during the war, Mitterrand has now come to ask for his payback. and he's going to ask for concessions, or he's going to ask her to be nice to Argentina to kind of build the peace or something like that. And Mitterrand says, Madame, vous avez montré ce que les Français ont appris depuis des siècles. Il ne faut pas plaisanter avec les Anglais.
Let's finalize here, dealing with the lady herself. She's 83 years old now. She's not very healthy. She's retired, away from public life. She had some strokes. She's got dementia, her daughter says. She's a baroness now, and she doesn't get involved with anything. But you teach here, King's College, undergraduate, graduate students. A lot of them are younger than, they were born after she left power, or soon near, close to that period. What do they make of Thatcher? What is their view as young people of what Thatcher and Thatcherism was all about?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. And most of my students, in fact, now, including those to whom I teach Thatcherism, are born after Thatcher left power, have no possibility of memories of her. I think their attitude, curious enough, is much more detached. I mean, I'm struck by the extent to which my contemporaries, my colleagues, still react to Thatcher in a very emotional way. I still feel that saying anything that is not unqualifiedly critical of Thatcher is a bad thing. My students, I think, are much more willing to recognise that she's not something to be treated as either a good thing or a bad thing, but just as a thing, as something that happened that's part of British history that we have to understand, that doesn't necessarily require approbation or condemnation. Of course, a lot of the debate on Thatcher, as far as the young is concerned, I think has been changed by what's happened to the Labour Party. So for someone of my generation, I mean, I've never actually voted for a political party other than the Labour Party. And I still belong to that generation of people for whom the Labour Party is like a football team. It's something which requires emotional support. It's very difficult to break away from your team even when you know it's going to lose every match for the rest of history. My students don't have that emotional link with the left. I mean, some of them have a link with a kind of non-party left of, the Green movement or the feminist movement. But the idea that anybody could feel emotionally attached to the Labour Party of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, I think, has gone. And so in that sense, the old left-right divisions are much more eclipsed as far as they're concerned.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.